you've been following the news at all in the past couple of months, and you know that there's turmoil in the Ukraine. Of course, with our classmates' informative speech as well. Following the ouster of the Russian-supported Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych, Russia has invaded the Crimean Peninsula, which is a region of land in the Black Sea that belongs to Crimea, and since annexed it as a part of the Russian Federation, much to the dismay of the international community. The most troubling aspect of this illegal seizure of land is that it seems to only be a stepping stone into continued Russian expansionism of foreign territory. The international community agrees that this is not acceptable, and that if Russia should decide to push further into the Ukraine, they must be met with an immediate and direct response. Today I would like to persuade you that a Russian invasion further into the Ukraine beyond the Crimean Peninsula is an imminent threat, and that the international community should respond with severe sanctions on the Russian Federation. After doing extensive research on the topic, it seems evident that Russia has no intention of stopping at the Crimean Peninsula. It may seem like an issue of little concern to those of us nowhere near Ukraine or Eastern Europe, but allowing the continued illegal seizure of land by another country, especially a military powerhouse like Russia, will have serious implications to not only the region, but to the United States and the rest of the world as well. In order to stress the seriousness of the issue, I would first like to persuade you that this is an imminent threat, and then go on to convince you that the plan that I propose, which is severe sanctions on Russia, is both practical and applicable. So now that I have established what the speech will encompass, I would like to move in to why there is a need for a plan of action in eastern Ukraine. That need can be boiled down to the fact that Russia, all signs point to Russia definitely intending to push into the eastern part of the Ukraine. According to U.S. Air Force General Philip M. Breedlove, who is also NATO's Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, Russia has enough troops amassed on the Ukrainian-Russian border to push through all of Ukraine to Transnistria, which is a separatist region on the west side of Ukraine that seeks to join Russia, much like the Crimean Peninsula did. In matter of fact, the exact Russian troop numbers, as stated by a CNN article, is estimated to be more than 30,000, not counting support troops, according to American officials. Despite this immense troop buildup, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, I think that's how you say it, assured U.S. Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel that Russian troops were merely conducting a spring exercise and had no intention of crossing the international line. Can we really believe this claim, though? Let's go back to an article I found on CNN by Barbara Starr, CNN Pentagon correspondent, dated from February 28th. In this article, this is prior to the Russian invasion of Crimea, mind you, this article discusses Russian troop exercises near the border of Russia and Ukraine. It also discusses Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov reassuring U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry that these exercises were pre-planned and had nothing to do with the turmoil going on in Ukraine. As we know, shortly after that, Russia invaded Crimea and has since annexed it. These two articles are eerily similar, and even if they don't prove Russian intent to move further into Crimea, the Ukraine, they should at least lead us to take Russian reassurances with a grain of salt and be prepared to act. This is also not the only motive for Russian military intervention into eastern Ukraine. The Crimean Peninsula, the Ukrainian territory that Russia has annexed and is also a Russian naval stronghold, is separated by Russia by a body of water. It is an almost unanimous assumption that Russia will push into eastern Ukraine, taking the Ukrainian cities of Donetsk, Luhansk, and Kharkiv, thereby building a land bridge into Crimea. On April 6th, pro-Russian protesters stormed government buildings in all three of these cities. According to an article by BBC News, after protesters broke into government buildings in the cities and barricaded themselves in, they hung Russian banners and flags from the windows. They are calling for a referendum on independence, which means they can either autonomously govern themselves or even possibly join the Russian Federation in the future, similar claims that were being made by Crimea. It is believed that many of these protesters are being paid and organized by Russia. This seems very plausible considering the claims made by Russian President Vladimir Putin that Russia has a right to intervene militarily into Ukraine if he should deem that ethnic Russians Russian speakers are in danger. So now that, as you can see, the situation is ripe for a Russian offensive, and the international community needs to be ready should this come to be. Now that we have seen that there is a need for a plan, I will explain to you why the plan that I propose is practical and the one that the international community should follow. This aggression must be met with further economic sanctions. I say further because economic sanctions have already been imposed on Russia prior to its invasion of the Crimean Peninsula. According to a BBC article from March 21st, the U.S. applied travel bans and froze the assets of 11 Russian individuals, and the European Union imposed similar sanctions on 21 Russian individuals, mostly politicians and officials. However, these sanctions have not done much to deter Russia, and further hostility must be met with a much more critical response, that being in the form of more severe economic sanctions. The same article talks about how Russia could be further isolated by direct economic sanctions, meaning import and export bans. This would be a huge blow to Russia, considering it exported $292 billion worth of goods to the European Union in 2013, Russia's largest trading partner. These export bans are the best weapon that the world has against further Russian aggression, while sanctions on Russia by the U.S. alone would have a minimal effect. Together with the European Union, they would have a devastating one. The area of export that should be directly slapped with bans is the oil and gas sectors. Russia exports 84% of its oil and 75% of its natural gas to the EU, accounting for a huge source of Russian GDP, a GDP that only grew at a meager 1.3% in 2013. With such weak growth, these sanctions would have a crippling effect on the Russian economy. You may be wondering why the European Union, who imports such a large amount of Russian gas, would be willing to go along with these sanctions. Let's look at Germany, who is the single largest importer of Russian gas, with Russian gas accounting for 40% of its total gas. In a CNN article by Mick Krever, German Chancellor Angela Merkel is quoted as saying that if the European Union were to impose stricter sanctions, Germany would be able to meet its energy needs by a united European energy market. Germany also is sitting on a large stockpile of coal. Having Germany on board with these sanctions gives the international community a huge amount of leverage on Russia. These sanctions are the most practical plan of action that can be enacted should Russia continue its aggression into the Ukraine. In conclusion, I would like to share a piece of history that should remind us all that illegal land grabs by another nation, even if they seem justified, should never be able to go without consequence by the rest of the world. A certain nation believed that after World War I, the winning powers had not divided the land up properly. They believed that certain territories belonged to them because they had at times throughout history been inside their borders, and the people there spoke the same language and shared a similar culture. They made the claim that these areas were taken away from them and being run by a conspiratorial group. They then took it upon themselves to invade and annex these regions. The nation I'm talking about is, of course, Nazi Germany. After claiming that the Sudetenland and the Rhineland were rightfully a part of Germany, they invaded and annexed both territories. They then invaded Austria, claiming they had a right to it because the people there spoke German and had a similar culture. They also wanted to join Nazi Germany, very similar to what's going on in the eastern Ukraine with Russia right now. Hitler, of course, believed in a Jewish conspiracy running Europe. Putin has been putting the blame on far-right Ukrainian nationalists, as well as the West in general. Hitler then continued to invade Poland, and the rest, of course, is history. Now, I'm not necessarily implying that Putin has intentions of world domination. What I am saying is that these actions must be viewed in the right light because they have the potential to escalate into something much more serious. One thing that history teaches us is that we must learn from it. Illegal land grabs by nations cannot be tolerated. I hope I have convinced you that a continued Russian military offensive is an imminent threat, and that the international community should be ready to act with severe economic sanctions should this come to be. Thank you. Questions?